Bet the Board.
What do you mean you don't bet? I mean, I don't bet. You know, I don't gamble. I don't. I never have, and I never will. Yeah, right. I'll bet you $20 I can get you gambling before the end of the day.
You owe me 15 grand, pal.
Pay him. Pay that man his money.
It's the Bet the Board podcast.
God likes me. He really, really likes me.
In the end, I wound up right back where I started. I could still pick winners, and I could still make money for all kinds of people back home. And why mess up a good thing?
Here's Payne Insider and Todd Fuhrman.
Welcome into the Bet the Board podcast, college football week 3. And while it may not be the most attractive slate on paper, the betting line provides the great equalizer as we'll deep dive some of the marquee matchups this weekend. I'm your host, Todd Fuhrman, joined as always by my college football colleagues, Brad Powers and Payne Insider. And gentlemen, how excited are we to watch some of these games that the scheduling gods have given us this Saturday?
On a scale to 1 to 10, I mean, I'm going to say a 5 just because I bet almost every one of these. But if it wasn't for that, it'd be like a 1.
Yeah, I was going to...
You are not the Russian judge, sir. That was a very, very soft grading scale you gave there. About a 1.5 for me.
Yeah, a little bit generous in terms of what we have. Thankfully, not to fast forward or try and move too quickly, at a very attractive slate next weekend. But Brad... I want to know if Payne was ready for the Miami-Florida State showdown that may go on to decide the ACC instead of Florida State-Clemson, given what we saw from the Hurricanes last weekend.
We joke about that, but from what I've seen, talent-wise from both teams, it's what the ACC was intended for when they put the two teams in opposite divisions. Maybe we finally get that matchup.
Payne, anything major that you saw last weekend in watching games that you wanted to hit on before we dive into the six-pack we have on store for our listeners today?
Well, first of all, I think it was this podcast, despite how you position us, was very high on Miami this season. Both Brad and I had them improved over 10 points, the Miami Hurricanes. And I know there was a lot of under money in the opening game against Miami, Ohio. We were trying to look to attack Miami in that game, whether it was a team total, whether it was a side, then all of a sudden you get the TVD finger injury, and it kind of left that one a little shaky for us. And we were very high on Miami in that spot against A&M, and so it's not surprising. And then you get Bethune-Cookman this week, and so the momentum's going to continue for Miami, and it's going to make that trip to Doak Campbell Stadium later this season all the more interesting.
It's always fascinating when you see some of these power programs start to get things headed in the right direction. Unfortunately for Nebraska fans, they have a long way to go. And Texas A&M football, not back, even if Texas is trending in the right direction. But all right, gentlemen, a little non-conference action in Columbia, Missouri to kick things off on Saturday morning between Kansas State and Missouri. Kansas State, pretty much a 5-point favorite in this matchup, painted across the board. The total down a touch from where it opened, sitting in that 48 range. And when you look at Eli Drinkwitz and his Tigers bunch, they should be motivated to avenge a 40-12 loss in Manhattan last year against Kansas State. When we look at Kansas State under Chris Kleiman's leadership, they've been one of the best teams in the country where it matters most at the betting window, going 33-18-1 ATS. It's tied for the third best in the FBS during that span. Meanwhile, in Missouri, they've had a little bit of success as a home underdog, pulling two outright upsets and an easy cover versus Georgia last year when they were catching 32 in their own building. But guys, I think there are a ton of questions that abound. You watch Missouri through their first couple of games of the season. It's not an offense that overpowers anybody. We know what Luther Burden can do in space. Clearly the most dynamic playmaker they have on this roster. Kansas State, nothing fraudulent about their final score against Troy last week, and the Trojans pull within striking distance, and then Kansas State is able to find another gear. Brad, when you look at these two teams early on in the campaign, it almost feels like Kansas State has been discounted in that Big 12 pecking order behind the Oklahomas and Texases of the world, and even TCU to a lesser extent. Meanwhile, Missouri, we know this is a team that's been relegated to mediocrity within the SEC East.
Yeah, obviously not the stiffest competition for either team so far through two games, but clearly Kansas State's overachieved. They've upgraded their power rating a couple of points. Missouri downgraded their power rating a couple of points, a couple of non-covers for the Tigers. you mentioned like Luther Burden. Outside of Luther Burden, I just don't see it from Missouri. And you wonder what's up with them. I think it's an offense that's averaging 5.7 yards per play, second to last in the SEC. They just can't get deep pass plays, explosive pass plays. So they have an okay quarterback in Brady Cook. He doesn't make many mistakes, but he also doesn't make a lot of plays. And in order to beat this Kansas State defensively, they limit the big plays. So I from what I've seen so far, I mean, Kansas State deservedly the road favorite.
It almost feels like Missouri fans are ready to run offensive coordinator Kirby Moore out of town. They saw some of those stat lines that Jake Haener put forth at Fresno State, but anybody who watched the Bulldogs last year realized that it was a lot of short passes, run after the catch, and very few deep shots that came in that dynamic. Payne, when you look at Missouri, if they have a path to not only covering but maybe winning this game outright, it's tough to sustain methodical drives against the Kansas State defense, albeit one that still lacks some of the headliners when you talk about losing your leading rusher to the NFL in the offseason. But as you try and assess Missouri's passing game, if they're made to be one-dimensional in this spot, do you feel there's a path for Brady Cook and Luther Burden to at least pick up chunk yardage and keep Kansas State, Will Howard and company on the sidelines?
You have to try, right? I mean, I think that's actually the key here, as crazy as that sounds. And you boys are right. Like, Missouri's offense has not come out of the gates hot if you scoreboard watch. And Brad, correct me if I'm wrong, you had a South Dakota ticket opening week, so you kind of envisioned this a little bit. It can't be this bad. Like, you have to think that maybe there's some level of possum being played here, because it just doesn't make sense when you have an OC like Kirby Moore, who is a former wide receiver. You got to open this thing up a little bit. And I also don't understand what transpired in the first game. Like, I get we understand what Brady Cook is, but he was on fire. And then he gets taken out in the third quarter for Horn. And you look at Missouri's passing offense, they averaged over half a point per play with Brady Cook in the opener. And then against MTSU, in a game that's far closer than expectation, Missouri throws it 19 times, runs it 43. And you look at the offense metrically, like, the passes from Brady Cook were successful 56% of the time, average positive 0.41 EPA per play. The runs, positive 0.02 EPA. So it's not that the offense hasn't been ineffective throwing it, they're just not throwing it, and I don't get it. And you look just at Brady Cook specifically, I understand the competition hasn't been elite, but 85% adjusted accuracy, that's tough to do on air. So I don't understand what's going on here. Clean pocket, 137 passer rating. You have a former 5-star receiver in Theo Weiss who transfers in. Luther Burden, obviously. I really like the pass catching back in Nathaniel Pete. He's got some burst when he's catching those dump offs. Let's see what that looks like. Get him in the slot, put him on a linebacker and a safety. I don't know that, like, when the dust settles, though, like, I think when we talked about Kansas State this offseason, we thought the defense would decline. We thought the secondary would probably dip because they only returned one starter back there in Savage. You want to test that area early, I would think. And even last year, it was a defense that was 70th in schedule-adjusted EPA per pass allowed, lost its best in Julius Brents. But, you look at that unit, I think what's interesting is, like, Jacob Parrish, for instance. He's been all the rave at corner for Kansas State. The coaches are comparing him to Terrence Newman, and through 2 games, again, against lesser competition, I understand, but he's allowed 33 yards on 16 targets, so maybe that secondary isn't an issue. Maybe he's going to remove Burden from this game completely because he could be that good. We also have the Will Lee kid who transferred in. I know Alabama wanted him, and he's allowed just 50 yards on 9 targets, but I still think you have to let Brady Cook find out what Kansas State's secondary truly is. There were some guys that were wide open there last week against lesser competition. What's the pass rush for Kansas State? I think that was a question for us coming into the season. They were moving linebackers to defensive end. I just don't think you can line it up 43 times against Kansas State's front. And if you listen to Missouri, they're saying the right things, right? This is kind of that mini rivalry. All week, they've talked about getting embarrassed by K-State last season. Brady Cook, if you listen to him in the MTSU postgame presser, immediately shifts focus to Kansas State. Said, we're going to prepare our butts off. This is a big one. We're hungry for this one. Ultimately, I think this comes down to price. I think there's a lot of guys that were hoping for potentially a 6 here on Missouri. We haven't gotten that yet. Let's see where this goes. There's some non-football things that could create some hidden value, right? This is the first sellout for a non-conference game since 2012 for Missouri. So the importance of what the players are saying this game means meshes with everything that's kind of going on there outside as well. And then Kansas State had to adjust its travel plans for this game because usually they fly straight from Manhattan to Columbia, but the regional airport is under construction, so K-State's going to bus it. So there's some tiny things here that maybe give you some hidden value on Missouri, but it hasn't been very good offensively to start the season.
You guys mentioned some of Brady Cook's numbers, and I mean, as far as his average depth of target, pretty staggering when you consider 26% of his passes have become behind the line of scrimmage, which is the 6th most in the SEC. 41% of passes have been thrown 0 to 9 yards beyond the line of scrimmage, 4th most in the league. 20.5% have been thrown 10 to 19 yards down the field, 10th most in the SEC, and just 10% have been thrown 20-plus yards downfield, second to last in the conference. To both of the points that you guys made, inferior competition in South Dakota and Middle Tennessee State. Brad, Payne mentioned the number. As far as the market, have you seen anything notable before we close the book on Missouri and Kansas State?
No, I think he's said it well. We're obviously in a dead number situation here. I tend to think it's more likely to trend down than back up to the 6, even though my power ratings have it closer to 6 than 5. But I think that handicapping 101 says spot Missouri. But, man, matchup-wise, I don't see the decisive edge that gets me the window on the Tigers.
These games are always fascinating early on. You'd have a data point from last year and try and figure out which of these teams has their identity firmly entrenched before they'll get in the heart of conference play, knowing that Kansas State draws UCF next week. But we do have a conference matchup taking place in Starkville between LSU and Mississippi State. These two programs first met in 1896, making it LSU's longest-running rivalry. Saturday will mark the 117th meeting between these two programs. The last time we saw LSU on a national stage, we know what transpired against Florida State, a game that was close halfway through the third quarter, got away from them in a hurry. So what does LSU do? They go out the following week and they exercise some of those demons against Grambling. Scored 72 points, tied for the third most in program history and most since 1977. If we back out that 7 overtime thriller against A&M in 2018, which was also a Bet the Board best bet that Thanksgiving weekend, while improving to 62-1 in non-conference home games. But you look at Mississippi State, this is a team when they stepped up in class over the last couple of meetings. As a 16.5-point home underdog against Georgia last year, were blown out 45-19. As a 17.5-point home underdog in 2021 against Alabama, lost by 40. You're looking at LSU at 9.5-point road favorite here, total up a touch from where it opened to that 54.5, 55 range. And Brad, I'll come to you first on this one. When you look at LSU, as far as their power number, Florida State appears to be the real deal. We'll get a better indication of where they are against Clemson as well next week. What kind of adjustments do you make given that data point that we saw on such a prominent stage where LSU looked ill-equipped in the secondary to slow down Florida State's big receivers?
Yeah, you certainly have to downgrade them from that performance. About 1.5 points for me that they were dominated, even though it wasn't a total shocker that, who would have thought that Mike Norvell would have made better halftime adjustments than Brian Kelly? I didn't see that one coming. Wow. But still got to downgrade LSU 1.5 points for that one. Didn't touch much the power rating. Last week, Grambling's a below average FCS team. So down. But I will say this, and we can dive deeper into the matchup, but I do go back to the Florida State game as much as we like Florida State. It's 17-17, about 6 minutes left in the third quarter. Lacey, the wide receiver from LSU, drops a pass that possibly goes for a touchdown if he holds on to it with the coverage that Florida State had. And even at that point in the game, while Florida State, I thought, did not play a great first half by any stretch of the imagination, LSU had 2 missed scoring opportunities inside the red zone. So it's not like LSU was extremely fortunate to be sitting there at 17-all at that point. So I think everyone final scoreboard says that they were pathetic in the game, and reality was for the first 40 minutes they played even with what I think is a legitimate top 5 5 caliber team in Florida State.
You mentioned some of the pitfalls in scoreboard watching, and there's no doubt for those folks who didn't tune in to watch Mississippi State play host to Arizona last weekend, they see a 31-24 final and go, okay, it was right around the number. Odds makers were correct, but you dig into some of those prices. I mean, Mississippi State finished -7 in the first down category. They were outgained by 124 yards. They were outpassed by nearly 180 yards, finished +4 in turnovers, and 3 of the Bulldogs' touchdown drives covered 50 yards or less, 2 of them from 30 yards or fewer out. Payne, the one thing we've seen from Mississippi State, and they said it this offseason, I wasn't sure we were necessarily going to believe it until we saw it on full display, that they wanted to be more balanced. We know what Mike Leach meant to the air raid. His unfortunate passing meant handing the baton to Coach Arnett. And you look at Mississippi State, they've run the ball on over 60% of its snaps through the first 2 games after calling about 52% pass plays, both, in what we've seen in the past. So clearly a lot more run than what we've grown accustomed to. But do we think this is the week where they air it out a little bit more, return to their DNA, and realize that Will Rogers is the most dynamic offensive player that they have on that side of the ball?
I think you guys also just made great points there. We understand that LSU probably played Florida State closer, but on that flip side, Todd, great job mentioning Mississippi State was not all that impressive last week with, I think Delora threw 3 picks in the first quarter. So
he's forcing the ball.
Yeah, you're kind of getting the double-edged whammy there with perception in opposite directions. So that's really top-notch stuff when you think about the price in this game. But to your actual question, I think that's the whole key here, right? I mean, we know what LSU's defensive issues were during spring ball, during fall camp. It's why they hit the portal so hard, right? They brought 5 guys to their secondary, and that's what we laid out in the opener against FSU. You need to attack this LSU defense through the air. You need to attack them in the intermediate to deep areas, and having size out wide helps a ton. The problem is Will Rogers, one of the best passers in the SEC, is going to break all kinds of passing records, is now operating, a run-first offense. And you said balanced. It's gone the opposite direction. There's nothing balanced about this. Yeah. I mean, how do you call 17 passes in a game against a Power 5 opponent? And that game was played for roughly 5 quarters. I mean, it's tough to fathom that in our year 2023. It's just bananas. And I saw the same article and presser you saw, Todd, and that, Zach Arnett's come out and said, no doubt, right? The offense ran too much against Arizona. We're going to throw a little bit more. But, the Bulldog offense is I don't think they can completely revert to its old ways. And if you weren't going to do it last week in a situation where it was tied and it was probably needed, I just don't understand. I don't know if they're going to be able to do it here, right? And then you think about, when they do pass the ball, right? The pass offense hasn't really done the things that we mentioned that you need to do to beat LSU through the air, right? I mean, Will Rogers' ADOT against Arizona was 5.1 yards. After 2 games, Will Rogers 120th out of 136 qualifying quarterbacks in depth of target. Rogers isn't throwing deep or in intermediate, right? It's like a lot of bubble screens and wide receiver screens. You go back to the Florida State game, I tracked this. Florida State threw 8 passes at or behind the line of scrimmage to receivers and tight ends. Bubble screen, wide receiver screen, right? That type of variant of throw, right? Those 8 throws gained a grand total of 15 yards, and Jordan Travis threw his only pick. The LSU corners are undersized, but they're still quick. And so that, to me, isn't the way you throw on LSU. And you look at the size of Mississippi State's pass catchers, the guys with the most snaps that have gone out for routes this year. It's Marks, it's Griffin, it's Wally, it's Robinson, and Whitmore. Only Justin Robinson's taller than 6 feet. So I don't see the matchup there being overly good, right? Like Arnett can say, hey, we're going to throw more. Like what kind of throws? Where are the parts of the field you're attacking? Do you have the talent to attack how you need to attack? I know LSU's defense followed up a horrific effort against FSU and allowed Grambling to gain 232 yards on their first 3 drives. So it's kind of scary to think about that. But then they hunkered down. And, there were signs in the first half against FSU that the front 7 is more than capable. And Mississippi State has an offensive line that was built for the air raid. Are they going to just be able to transition that style and maul guys in the trenches once they face tougher competition like LSU? And you look, 27% of the Bulldogs' runs have been stuffed by a directional school and an Arizona defense that we don't think is great. And now you have the Wingo-Smith combination fully healthy back in the middle. I'm just not sure Mississippi State has the right scheme or personnel to consistently threaten LSU in their vulnerable areas.
Brad, you have a lot of familiarity, obviously, with Brian Kelly as a head coach. We saw him go backfield by committee, wouldn't commit to a guy. Logan Diggs became that guy last week against Grambling. Obviously, not exactly the stiffest competition, but when you look at that situation, is Kelly the kind of guy that wants to find a bell cow back, or do you think he's going to continue to ride a hot hand and it could be a different guy featured every week, knowing that LSU's offensive line is still going through some reshuffling in its own right?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of depends. They really never consistently had a bell cow back at Notre Dame. Maybe a few years, like Josh Adams would step forward, but he's never been a coach that turn around and hand it off and give one single back 25, 30 carries a game. So I think it's a little bit more running back by committee until they see more. I wouldn't be a bit surprised it ends up being Logan Diggs by the middle of the season. I mean, there's a reason why they brought him in, and obviously Logan Diggs played for Kelly, and Kelly recruited him at Notre Dame. But I will say one thing. I'm normally a very pessimistic person when it comes to Kelly. If there's one thing he is elite at, it's beating the teams that he's supposed to, especially when he revamped Notre Dame's, his second part of his tenure there in 2017. They didn't lose these types of games. They went out and took care of business. And I'll say this, I expected kind of a flat effort against Grambling, short week. You just got crushed. Offensively, I didn't see, that I saw a sense of urgency offensively, and I kind of liked seeing that, and I think that sense of urgency continues in this game.
Yeah, this is kind of the start to the second season, and we'll see this across the country as conference games get going. A non-conference loss, especially to a team the caliber of Florida State for LSU, doesn't exactly provide a death knell in the season. The SEC West appears to be more wide open on paper than what we've seen in the last handful of years, so no reason that LSU can't potentially be that team if they were to start things off with a resounding win here. It's also interesting that LSU will be able to go back and watch some of the tape of the Arizona game, knowing that Jaden Daniels' skill set very similar to Jaden Delora in terms of his mobility and where Delora was able to have success. So you look at LSU in that road favorite category, not quite at double digits, but laying more than a touchdown in this spot. You can follow Brad on Twitter at BradPower7. You, of course, can follow Payne there as well at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Fuhrman. Follow me on social media, and most importantly, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. If you haven't already subscribed to the Bet the Board newsletter, I can't tell all of you guys and girls enough to do so. It is the single easiest way to get an additional best bet added to your portfolio every single weekend throughout the fall. Jamal Williams, under 12.5 rushing yards, got you the window, albeit with a little bit of sweat on his final carry of the game, going for exactly 11, but a winner is a winner nonetheless.
Longest rush, because he certainly cleared 12.5.
That's a good point. I think his rushing total was a lot closer. Yes, longest rush at 12.5. I'm not sure that would have been a good best bet if we went under 12.5 total rushing yards in that particular spot. Guys, when we look at non-conference games, it's matchups like these that are fascinating and oftentimes what makes college football so great. When you have one team that likes to conduct its business in one manner and another that wants to go about things completely differently. And that's what we're going to see in Chapel Hill this weekend when North Carolina welcomes in Minnesota. And it's North Carolina more than a touchdown favorite in this spot. Total sits at 50. North Carolina as a program hasn't had consecutive 3-0 starts since 1996-97. It was Mac Brown's last two seasons, the first time around as head coach there. They've started 3-0 only two times total from 98 to 2018. When we look at the Gophers, they're playing a true road game against a non-conference team ranked in the AP Top 25 for an extremely rare occurrence. The first such meeting for them, they fell in recently, I should say the last meeting, back in 2011 against USC. It's only a situation that's come up 13 times now since 1960. When we look at the Gophers, they haven't exactly thrived on the road against good teams in conference. 0-5 straight up, 1-4 against the number under head coach PJ Fleck. And when we look at the total, if this number were to close below 50, North Carolina's only had 5 closing totals under 50 going back to 2019. All 5 of those have gone over the closing number. Brad, when we look at Minnesota offensively, they beat Nebraska, slipped by the skin of their teeth. Wasn't exactly a dynamic effort by any stretch of the imagination in their performance last weekend against Eastern Michigan. But if you look at the Gophers year over year, does this team appear to have the same DNA, or do you have a lot more questions about some of the personnel that PJ Fleck has in place to play his keep-away style of ball?
Well, you thought losing an all-time leading rusher in Ibrahim that maybe there might be some issues in the run game at the running back spot. They lost some key offensive linemen as well, but that hasn't been the issue so far for Minnesota. In fact, I think they found their running back of the future just last week. Their most highly decorated recruit in this year's freshman class was a running back, Darius Taylor. He ran well for more than 150 yards last week. So I think they got their bell cow there. I wasn't a huge Tanner Morgan fan, especially post-2019. But my goodness, so far from what I've seen from Kaliakmanis, I actually see regression from where he was a year ago. I expected him to progress with added experience. Hasn't been the case. This is a passing offense that has struggled to say the least. I think Pro Football Focus ranks the passing offense number 104, and that's despite the fact that they also graded the pass blocking third best in the country. So he's getting time. He's getting a relatively clean pocket, and he's just missing throws. If you go back to the Nebraska game, so many missed opportunities in the pass game for him in that one. And then obviously, they didn't do a good job last week. In fact, they took the ball out of his hands for a majority of that game, just turned around and handed it off. So my major question on that side of the ball is you're going to have to do something to keep pace with the North Carolina offense. So I haven't seen it yet from Kaliakmanis, and I guess no one else has in the market either. We've seen this this spread tick up from an early number 4.5 all the way through key numbers.
You mentioned that North Carolina offense, Brad. It was interesting that you get a sophomore quarterback in Drake May, who's obviously the headliner for the Heels. Basically compare last week's win against Appalachian State to getting a B on a test that you didn't study for. The best possible outcome for an underprepared team. Awfully strong words from a quarterback knowing that they had to fight tooth and nail for the second straight season against Appalachian State. And the reality of it is that we saw North Carolina defensively look like a brick wall in their opener, Payne, against South Carolina. They got after the quarterback. I'm not sure if that was a combination of North Carolina being better than advertised or South Carolina just having way too many holes on that offensive line to shore up. But Brad highlighted some of the ineffectiveness in the passing game for Minnesota. We know if it's up to the Gophers, they'd run it on 99 out of 100 plays. Against this North Carolina defense, do you think there is a path for Minnesota to do what they want offensively? Because we still haven't seen the real Tar Heel defense step up with two performances that are on opposite ends of the spectrum.
I think that's exactly what we find out here, because on the surface, North Carolina's defense appears improved through two data points. Last season they were outside the top 100 in schedule adjusted efficiency. Right now, kind of plotting inside the top 60. The question mark we had with Minnesota coming into the season was the style they wanted to play, if their offensive line was going to take a step back or not, right? It appeared like a problem on paper, the interior of the line. You lose three starters up front, including your all-world center, John Michael Schmitz. Didn't look good in the spring game. Weren't getting a ton of push there. And then the offense struggled mightily in the opener against Nebraska, getting pushed as well. You look, the Gophers were held to a 24% rushing success rate, only 3% of runs graded explosive against that Cornhusker defense. That, to me, is the entire factor in this game, because Minnesota hasn't shown an ability to actually pass the ball or keep a defense on its heels or just kind of throw that occasional changeup pitch. So it's very much about the North Carolina defensive front versus the Gophers O-line. And I don't know if UNC's defensive line is truly improved. I think it's impossible not to be better. But, you look, Appalachian State found success in the trenches against North Carolina last week. Right, it was like 5.2 yards a carry, 58% rushing success rate on standard downs, nearly a 15% explosive run rate. And now I think maybe we realize Minnesota faced a Nebraska front seven better than almost anyone projected. And so, while it wasn't good in the opener, there's at least a little bit of an excuse for that performance. But really, this is the only path for Minnesota in this game, right? It's just completely contrasting styles. The Gophers have to be able to run it and control tempo, because that's been the sticking point for UNC all offseason about the rule changes. It's like, we need to go faster than we did before to make up for the amount of plays lost due to the new clock rules. And so this is one of those situations where you have the running dog, but if they're not able to run the ball as efficiently as they need to in this, then it gets a little bit more difficult, because if Drake May somehow builds a lead and forces Minnesota out of its run game comfort zone, it's over. I think we talk all the time about teams and games in all shapes and sizes, but I very much feel a little bit similar to last season's Pittsburgh game, Todd. I know we were looking at that one taking +3. It took a lot of sharp money. I believe it closed pick. And that was a game where UNC wanted to establish the ground game, win that trench battle. But eventually, Pitt just didn't have enough offensive punch to go toe-to-toe with Drake May. I want to ask you this because it's an interesting question, and I don't know if it's going to happen, or maybe I'm reading too much into it. Interested to hear both your thoughts. Mac Brown, I don't know if you followed this. He joined UNC's emergency board of trustees meeting this week, and it related to Tez Walker. And UNC's board is being very supportive of Tez, and they said all options are on the table, both on the field and with a lawsuit. Pure speculation. But I'm starting to get the vibe that UNC may just say, fuck the NCAA here, and we're going to play Tez, if not for the mental health, but they also owe it to Drake May to provide him with an actual number one option and not hinder the draft stock. And I think, right, when the kids you're recruiting see 9 or 10 wins on the field, they don't give a shit if after this season the NCAA removes a couple wins from Mac Brown's lifelong coaching record. Am I overthinking this, or do we think there's a vibe here that they may throw Tez Walker out here at some point?
There is growing support among some of the college football personalities that cover the sport day in, day out that North Carolina may go that route. I'm a little bit more skeptical that North Carolina would pull that and put him out there. But look, at this point, we know the NCAA is more toothless than they've ever been in the past. College football specifically closer to breaking off and doing their own thing. So while it might be unprecedented, I don't think you can completely rule it out. Tez being in uniform on Saturday and them going the hell with it. We're going to make the NCAA rule with an iron fist in some capacity and tell us that this can't happen going forward. But Brad, I didn't want to steal your thunder. I wasn't sure what your thoughts there were as well.
No, I echo your sentiments, and I hope they do it, to be honest with you, because I think that would be, when we look back at the death of the NCAA, that would be one of the indicators. So I'm rooting for North Carolina to go ahead and just say screw it and play.
One last thing for you guys.
First guy through the wall gets a little.
That feels comfortable answering. Drake May, when you look at his numbers, he's thrown just 6 passing touchdowns to go with 6 interceptions in his last 6 starts after starting his career with a 34-3 touchdown interception ratio. And I thought what was interesting is that Chip Lindsey after the game, and this is a direct quote, talking to the App State coaches after the game, they were doing their best to keep Drake from throwing over the head. That's why Omarion Hampton had a big day. We saw this in the NFL. Teams adjusting with a too high safety look to Patrick Mahomes, and we knew how long it took the Kansas City Chiefs to figure out a path of success. Are we worried about Drake May, or does this pressure fall squarely on Chip Lindsey to adjust the offense and basically take what opposing defenses give them, knowing that he's going to be sacrificing some of Drake May's potential gaudy stat lines?
Do you want to go, Brad? I think,
no, go ahead.
I think you answered your own question, Todd. I mean, this is the way defenses are going to play North Carolina and Drake May. We saw it towards the end of last season, and it worked out pretty well. And now when you don't have a Tez Walker who's going to create space for your defense, create space for the offense rather, right? So some of those underneath routes can be a little bit more efficient and effective. It becomes a lot more difficult. So this isn't anything new. Go back to the end of last year. It's how defenses started playing Drake May, and it certainly limited the explosiveness of the North Carolina offense. You lose Josh Downs, who not only was a deep threat, but really a great route runner in those intermediate areas. And now you don't have Tez Walker to stress a defense. They're just kind of playing this umbrella coverage on everyone, just making Drake May's life much easier, or much tougher, rather.
I mean, you guys have said it in the past. College football is a sport where a lot of these programs rely on chunk plays to go out there and do damage because it's so hard for some of these 18, 19, and 20-year-old kids to be able to sustain drives, not shoot themselves in the foot with a penalty here or there. Even with an NFL-caliber quarterback, it'll be interesting to see how Drake May, Chip Lindsey, and that North Carolina offense obviously adjust when they get into that higher level of familiarity within conference. And again, from a non-conference game, we jump right back into a conference play in the SEC East, where it's Georgia taking on South Carolina. And Georgia, of course, a massive favorite, like they will be in about 97% of their games this season. Nearly a 4-touchdown price tag down there at Sanford Stadium. Total on the game in the mid-50s, 54.5. Georgia will look to extend its best 20-game home winning streak. Among others, last team to win in Athens was South Carolina, which upset Georgia in double overtime 4 years ago. When we look at Georgia, combined victory margin over the last 2 weeks, 93-10, but UT Martin and Ball State far from a murderer's row. Brad, this is a Georgia Bulldog team coming into the year that had a path laid out perfectly for them to win the SEC, put themselves right back in the college football playoff, and have a chance to three-peat as national champions. But you look at them through their first 2 games, and there are some potential red flags that are already starting to emerge, whether it's concerns about the pressure rate, the lack of explosive plays in the ground game. You don't want to overreact to 2 data points, but what is your takeaway from Georgia through the first 120 minutes of football we've seen this edition of the Bulldogs play?
Well, obviously, you got to downgrade them. I know they played a couple of tomato cans, but from what you've seen, I've downgraded them about 1.5 points in my power ratings. To me, looks like they're sleepwalking. They don't look very motivated, and I think that coincides. I mean, if you were to stack rank who's looked the best on the team, the 5'8", 170-pound wide receiver Muse in the special teams and whatnot looks like their best player. And that even goes back to the spring game. He looked like the best player. I mean, he's playing like his life is dependent on the game. The rest of the team lacks that similar energy. I think the major concern as far as the downgrade would be the offensive line. I know Carson Beck hasn't looked overwhelming, but I mean, there's just no excuse for Georgia against an FCS opponent in Ball State not to get much push up front. I mean, they're number 74 in PFF and run blocking, 99 rushing yards against Ball State, and that's what I saw before I even started diving into the numbers. Rewatching the game, I'm like, my goodness, they're getting no push up front against a Ball State defense that's not even known as really good even in the MAC. So they've had some running back injuries, so they're not fully healthy there, but still you would expect to see, with the way they've recruited, you would expect to see some rushing explosives. Haven't seen that. Now the question is, do they wake up because they're playing an SEC opponent finally? That's to be determined. And I know Payne will get in the other side of the ball. There is a reason why they're such a significant favorite here, and that'll be the mismatch on the other side.
Well, you mentioned the other side of the ball, and when we look at Georgia defensively so far this year, allowing under 250 yards per game, holding their opponents to less than 3.8 yards per play, a third down success rate, 21% for their opponents, and all 3 of those through 2 data points are an improvement over what Georgia allowed last year. And they completely bottled up Spencer Rattler in last year's meeting, held him to 118 passing yards, forced 2 interceptions. Payne, we talked about it earlier, trying to figure out exactly what the offense or defensive line, was for North Carolina, given the fact that they sacked Rattler 9 times in that Week 1 game where UNC dominated the Gamecocks. In steps a Georgia defense that has a lot more dudes that are going to be playing on Sundays than what North Carolina can boast. How do you assess that side of the ball and try and figure out what South Carolina needs to do, not to pull off the outright upset, but to keep the number potentially inside this 4-touchdown tariff?
Yeah, these are the games I hate because my core number doesn't get to the current price, and I'm just praying we never see a 28.5. And yeah. There's kind of a little art to a handicap like this because Georgia hasn't looked great to Brad's point, so I think most bettors have probably at best kept their power rating flat or dropped Georgia a point or 2. And you mentioned how lethargic the Dogs have been on offense, and some of those slow starts obviously are not having key cogs like Ladd McConkey and Dawan Edwards. It sounds like the latter there, Dawan Edwards, is going to play here. It's the SEC opener. Kirby's using something Tonka Hemingway said during SEC Media Days to get Georgia fans and players fired up. And, the last home loss that Kirby Smart's had in the Georgia era was to South Carolina. And I know there was a question that Kirby got asked this week about the improvement he's seen from South Carolina this season. And to not provide bulletin board material, Kirby immediately credited his friend and the former staffer there, Shane Beamer, on how he pulled off 2 big upsets last season. And I thought that was a dead giveaway to how Kirby felt about this year's South Carolina team, because I think it's how we all feel on this show. And, the matchup on both sides of the trench is not very good. And Georgia's first team defense, I know they don't get to the quarterback all that often. It's kind of been the MO. Like, they don't get to the quarterback a ton in this style and scheme of defense. You can go back to us breaking Georgia games down 3 years ago. And it's kind of that style. But the first team defense has not surrendered a point yet this season. And then I immediately think about the types of offenses that have given Nick Saban and Kirby Smart trouble over the years. It's typically not pro-style offenses, especially pro-style offenses that aren't overly sophisticated, that didn't actually work in the pros and have trouble blocking up front. And so I think this kind of becomes very difficult for South Carolina. The offense to this point has played a middling UNC defense and then FCS Furman. And the Gamecocks offensive line has looked poor in both matchups. If you look on the season, the Gamecocks are averaging negative 0.33 yards before first contact. Runners are literally being contacted for the first time on average behind the line of scrimmage. 51% of South Carolina runs have been stuffed through 2 games. Over 30% of South Carolina runs have graded negatively. So I don't know how South Carolina shrinks this game, and that's kind of what you're looking for, when you have a dog this large. Spencer Rattler, you look at him. He's been fantastic. Gotten rid of the ball in 2.4 seconds on average through 2 games. He's still being pressured on 33% of dropbacks. And I think you give Rattler credit because he hasn't had a single turnover-worthy play, despite defenders being up his ass the entire game. So he's just kind of hot potatoing the football, and the ADOT is super low. And so it's very difficult to move the ball on a Georgia defense throwing quick, short passes without a ground game. And you look at Rattler, like the ADOT's like roughly 7.5 yards. How many plays in a series are you going to win against Georgia's defense to get into scoring range, right? If you're moving the ball at like 7 yards, 7-yard ADOT, and you can't run, like it's just, I don't think you can methodically move it on Georgia. And kind of like just back to what I said at the top, like our core number on this game is like 25-2, right? If it got to 28.5, traditionally that should be a bet. My fear is like Georgia finds a gear that we haven't seen, and that my 2-point dip in their power rating might not be warranted. And I think for kind of early listeners of this show, like the higher the spread, the less valuable the points, right? And so this isn't like, the 3-point edge here from like 25.5 to 28.5 is far different than having 3 points of edge from like 1.5 to 4.5, right? The difference between those two variants of 3 points is like the size of the ocean here. And so it's just, I don't know if I want to get in front of Georgia in this spot. I think they really stifled a better South Carolina offense last season in South Carolina. And it just kind of feels like Kirby's just trying to get these guys motivated somehow in that first SEC game with some chatter going on, and this being the last home loss they had to South Carolina. I don't know. I don't really want to step in front of Georgia.
Brad, I think you used the perfect word in the handicap for this. It's sleepwalking, and if Georgia does awake from that slumber, I mean, they have all the pieces to go out there and win this game by 40 points and completely take the air out of anything South Carolina wants to do offensively. But to your guys' point, everyone has a buy point, sometimes then teams that we don't necessarily want to back, so it'll be interesting to see how the market moves, knowing that this will be the marquee game essentially in that 3:30 Eastern time slot on CBS Saturday afternoon. But if that SEC game, at least on paper, doesn't offer all that much in the way of intrigue, this game always does. And last year we saw Tennessee finally break through, beating the Gators 38-33, albeit coming up just short at the betting window. But they got going late in that contest and really had the Gators defense on skates. It snapped a 5-game series skid for Tennessee against the Florida Gators. Tennessee's now won just 2 of the last 18 meetings between those programs. And the Gators haven't lost in Gainesville to Tennessee since 2003. Brad, we trade notes sometimes going into the podcast, and you found something that I think was fascinating that we should share with the listeners, even before we get into the X's and O's, to put some historical context on what this number Saturday with Tennessee right around a 6.5-point road favorite means to series history.
Yeah, when I first looked at the spread, I mean, instead of, obviously I'm looking to bet a number, but then I thought to myself, I'm like, wow, Tennessee favored by a touchdown at Florida. When's that happened? Because I've been watching college football my entire life, and I couldn't recall off the top of my head when they had been such a big favorite, and went back as far as where I could find ATS logs all the way back to 1976, and they've never been more than a field goal favorite at Florida. In fact, barely favored in the only 2 times where it's been close to them even being favored. In 2015, they were pick'em, lost the game. I think that was the game that I think it was the Hail Mary pass for Florida. And then 1993, they were a 1-point favorite at Florida, lost that game as well. So historic territory. It's not actionable for those listening. I'm not saying you'll blindly bet Florida because of the historic point spread here, but I like history. I like outliers, and man, Tennessee in a very unique position here as far as series history.
I do think, though, Brad, that makes for an interesting storyline because, Payne, you follow programs in the state of Florida closer than anybody, and when we look at Billy Napier, he needs that scalp on the wall. He doesn't have it yet. He obviously built a little bit of goodwill with the Florida Gators fans and boosters with the season opener last year. They took care of business against Utah, and that was essentially the high point that we saw from UF football. When we look at Florida, they're trying to avoid being under 500 through 3 games for the first time since 1992. Napier's yet to win a rivalry game. Essentially, if we call Tennessee, LSU, Georgia, and Florida State, went 0-4 in those games and became the first Florida coach since Charlie Pell in 1979 to go winless in rivalry games during his first season in Gainesville. How important is this game knowing that Miami, Florida State, and UCF to a lesser extent are really picking up momentum as it looks to the recruiting trail just within the Sunshine State?
Yeah, it's huge. I mean, Miami got their signature win last week for Mario Cristobal, and recruits simply see who the good recruiting schools are. They don't understand that A&M might be a little bit down, that their defensive coordinator is inept. They just see, hey, A&M's a monster on the trail. Miami dominates that game, and so you're already seeing some recruiting momentum for Miami, and this is kind of that game for Billy Napier and the Florida Gators that they need to get, because you fast forward to that 2024 schedule, and it's a bear. And so you're wondering if Napier gets out alive after 2024 because that schedule's so difficult. So this is a monster one. Florida's got a top 5 recruiting class right now. Are they going to be able to keep all of the components of that together? There's some whispers, right? A defensive end is kind of looking around. A linebacker's kind of looking around. You got Wardell Mack, and he's taking unofficial visits to Florida State at this point. So you got to keep that class together, and a signature win here would be massive for Florida and Billy
Brad,
Napier.
you mentioned the number there. Florida hasn't exactly been a home underdog all that often. Since 2018, it's happened 4 times. They've gone 4-0 against the spread in those contests. 3 of the 4 outright upsets, one of them a narrow loss to Alabama as a 2-touchdown underdog. But when we look at this Tennessee team coming into the season, we weren't sure exactly what the transition was going to look like. From Hendon Hooker, who was the consummate pro, did everything that Josh Heupel and company wanted him to do, leading this high-powered attack, handing the baton to Joe Milton. And I guess the best adjective I can use to describe Tennessee through the first 2 games, a one-sided win against Virginia and a game against Austin Peay that felt like it was interrupted 37 times like every other game last Saturday because of lightning, would be erratic. What have you seen from Joe Milton and this Vols offense, who clearly have lost a little bit at the wide receiver position without Jalen Hyde and Cedric Tillman? Not to show any disrespect to Ramel Keaton and Brew McCoy, but there's a reason that Brew McCoy has never asserted himself as a true alpha in any receiving room he's been in during his college tenure.
Yeah, erratic, inconsistent, concerning. Even though they put up points in the opener and ended up pulling away late against Austin Peay, I guess. 30-13. That was when you're a 48.5 point favorite and you fall short of the spread offensively by 2 touchdowns plus. That leaves some concern and some bad taste in your mouth if you're a Tennessee backer. We thought this could be the case. Milton, for every wow throw that he'll have, there's just inconsistency on a down-to-down basis, and I've seen that from Tennessee's offense. There's particular things in the Tennessee offense that I've liked, particularly the running back position, but the reality is just a basic stat, yards per attempt, per pass attempt. We're talking about this year's Tennessee offense nearly 3.5 yards less than last year. Every time they go back to pass and have a passing attempt, 3.5 yards less than they were a year ago. And this, there hasn't been many explosives. And this is an offense that's predicated because of their splits to get explosives in the pass game, and they just haven't been there. And it's not like they played the 85 Bears. I mean, it's been Virginia and Austin Peay. So I am concerned from what I've seen. Although I will mention this. I do find it still interesting that in a Tennessee uniform, this is year 3, I can't believe he still hasn't thrown an interception, Milton. I'm going to jinx him. I mean, if you're a Florida fan, and maybe I just gave you some good news there, but he is still not throwing an interception in a Tennessee uniform.
Look, I mean, we know Milton can throw the ball a country mile. I think the biggest question that all of us had was his ability to command an offense that focuses on precision, getting in and out of the huddle, and taking advantage of some of the matchups while a defense on the other side is unsettled. Now, some of that may be attributed to Tennessee not having their full complement of offensive line talent. We'll see if Cooper Mays returns this week. There's a lot of optimism, although the injury reports haven't said he's a definitive return. The folks I've talked to think he'll be out there under center, which always helps going into hostile territory. But Payne, when you look at this Tennessee offense, we saw Florida defensively perform probably a little bit better than that scoreline against Utah indicated. But do they have the athletes? Do they have the discipline? Do they have the structure to go out there and prevent some of the big plays that Tennessee relies on from beating them over the top and taking the Gainesville faithful out of that crazy atmosphere at the Swamp on Saturday night?
I think you said that perfectly because that is the biggest question here. And, it's all about Austin Armstrong being able to slow down Josh Heupel's offense enough to stay within touch. I don't think you're going to completely shut those guys out. They got a lot of talent over there. They go at a rapid breakneck pace. I don't also love all the defensive parts for Florida. I know Brad and I were talking while we were watching the Utah game, and the D line just doesn't have a ton of quick twitch speed guys, but they do have enough bulk to force Joe Milton to be a passer in known passing situations. And I think Florida's defense was impressive even with Cam Rising out in that opener. They held Utah to a 35% rushing success rate. And then you think about, giving up that 70-yard explosive on the first drive because you get a little too aggressive. And then you only allow Utah to gain 31% of available yards in that game despite that massive explosive. And from what I've seen, it's the same exact thing Brad saw, right? Against Virginia and Austin Peay. Tennessee's offense has been pretty sluggish, and it's not shocking, right? The Vols offense misses Hendon Hooker and Hyatt and Tillman and Wright. They're 4 key cogs to that offense that were all selected in the top 74 picks. It's tough to replace NFL guys of that caliber. And I know when we did our preseason preview, there was 2 areas that we thought not just losing those guys would regress, but even if they had all 4 back, it was going to regress. I mean, it was green zone scoring and the 3-and-out rate. And we've seen about a half point less per trip inside the 40 for Tennessee, and that's against really poor defenses. And the rate of 3-and-outs has increased relative to what the Vols offense was doing with Hendon Hooker last season. And so, yes, they're still going at a breakneck speed, but it isn't as effective if you're not stacking multiple first downs on top of each other and you're going 3-and-out a little bit more often. So that, I think, is the key to this game because of some of those guys along Florida's front that look like they're a little bit out of shape.
Yeah.
And so that to me is huge here. But it just feels like, the overall level of consistency from Tennessee's offense hasn't been there. The receiving core of Brew McCoy and Squirrel White and Thornton and Keaton, they've kind of underwhelmed to this point. Right now, the 3 highest graded pass catchers the Vols have, they're all running backs through 2 games. So it's not looking great. None of those guys have stepped up and become the man there. There's a few things also, right? You're looking at Austin Armstrong. I mentioned this, likes to be really aggressive on the defense. And I understand Tennessee hasn't really hit a ton of explosives, but you almost want to dial back the aggression a little bit and not let Joe Milton's cannon arm beats you 2-3 times deep to where it just changes the entire complexion of the game. You want to make Joe Milton read a defense, throw into a window, force him to get to his second or third read. And I know Napier's talked about slowing Joe Milton's legs down this week. Certainly in high leverage situations, you see mobile quarterbacks be a little bit more willing to take off. And so I kind of understand that. But to me, Milton hasn't really been overly dynamic or explosive, and maybe we see a different version of him, right? I mean, I know we talked off air, like the run heard around the world this season is Joe Milton stiff-arming a Virginia defender and rushing for a grand total of 4 yards. It had 9 million views on social media. That was interesting to me. And then you dig into the numbers. You dig into the numbers, and it's like, Virginia and Austin Peay have stuffed 33% of Joe Milton's runs. Milton's 9 rush attempts have gained 3.6 yards, and in 2.5 of them are before contact, which means the O-line's doing at least a decent job. Like, Milton's legs visually or metrically to this point don't appear super explosive and dynamic. He just feels like a physical downhill runner that you kind of need to stop before he starts. And so, again, this to me is the biggest factor because I don't see the Gators offense doing a ton here. I think we all kind of believe that the Tennessee's defense is a little bit, it's starting to kind of trend in the right direction the last 2 seasons. They're starting to get, recruit a little bit better, getting a different type of athlete on that side of the ball. So to me, it's on Austin Armstrong and Florida's defense to keep this game within range. The Swamp is a very difficult place to play at night. They've, that stadium has certainly made life difficult for far better quarterbacks than Mr. Milton.
Let me tell you one thing. After watching Virginia for the better part of 3 quarters last week against James Madison, they shouldn't be a defensive measuring stick for any opposing offense anytime soon, given what Tony Elliott has on that side of the ball. You want to talk about a slow defense that lacks athleticism? Virginia may be the poster child for said scenario when we look at Power 5 conferences as the season progresses. Anything else, guys, that you wanted to add on this game, which is clearly the marquee game, especially in prime time, knowing the limited slate that we have on Saturday?
No, but I'm guessing that there's a small hope for Payne putting his Florida State hat on that Florida doesn't get an outright win here.
Yeah, despite what I said about Joe Milton, let's have a big day, sir. Let's have a big day.
You want to fire him up. Use some of that negative affirmation to make sure he plays with a chip on his shoulder. Going out.
Hopefully this finds its way into the Vols
to perform at his best. The final game of the night, at least one that most eyes in the college football world will be watching, will again be in Boulder, where Colorado has moved to the forefront of all college football discussion. The spotlight continues to get even brighter. Big noon kickoff for Fox will be there for the 2nd straight week. College Game Day headed out there for the nationally televised nightcap. Largest crowd at Folsom Field since 2018 helped the Buffs to a dismantling of Nebraska. First time Game Day will be in Colorado as a result since 1996. Brad, look, Colorado is the story. We talked about them coming into the year, the upgrades. We talked about them after week 1. We may as well play the hits around here like we're a top 40 radio station. What have you done to Colorado's power rating after another data point and a 20-plus point win last Saturday?
Upgrade, significant upgrade. So now since the start of the season, they're up 11 points. Since the end of last season, they're up 22 points. Have I seen, if I took away, if I just was looking at the take off the name on the uniform, the hoopla around Dion and the market and everything, just from what I'm watching, would I have a 22-point upgrade on the team? Probably not. I think the market's kind of forced me to upgrade them a little bit more than what I am really comfortable with. But just because I don't want to continue to take these big positions against Colorado until I feel like I got a good, solid handle on this team. And, we can start diving into this. There are some massive deficiencies for me to upgrade a team 22 points and a team still getting absolutely dominated at the line of scrimmage. Worst in the country if you start looking at some of these rush metrics. I'm a little uncomfortable just from past history, as far as I'm concerned, upgrading that team 22 points in the start of the season. I've never done this before with a team's power rating.
Well, let's talk about some of those deficiencies then, because we know Shedeur Sanders is grabbing all the headlines. The numbers he's put forth, we haven't seen a Colorado quarterback do since Coy Detmer was able to put up back-to-back 350-plus yard passing games. We've seen the receivers on full display, and it's been a trio of them. Xavier Weaver, Horn, when you look at Travis Hunter, all of these guys going out there and performing. But at the same time, what's been absent in this entire equation is any semblance of balance for Colorado. But can Colorado State be the team to make Colorado be one-dimensional, force them out of their comfort zone, and take advantage of their extra time off, knowing that Colorado State, let's not sugarcoat it, doesn't have the same athletes on either side of the ball that they're going to face this week in the Rocky Mountain Showdown?
Oh, I don't think so. I think we kind of got a preview. My numbers say Colorado. I want to get to the window on Colorado State here, and I think if you're looking to bet Colorado State, you need to wait and see if you can get a little bit better number late in the week. But the concerning thing for me is they're coming off a bye, but that week 1 game they played. I won't say a completely similar style offense, but similar enough that I would, have some great concerns about the effectiveness of Colorado State's defense. I still have Lincoln Victor running up and down the field because I bet Colorado State in that game for Washington State. Could not stop it. You had a dual threat quarterback that was pass first, similar to Shador. You had 4 or 5 wide receivers that Colorado State defensively just couldn't match up with, similar to Colorado. So significant concerns there. And then on the other side of the ball, you got a first-time, a new quarterback for Colorado State. They're going to go to this Fowler and Nicolosi kid. Hostile territory for him. How's he going to handle it? I can tell you this. The Colorado State offensive line doesn't look much better than a year ago, and they were arguably the worst offensive line in the country. So while Colorado hasn't looked overwhelming up front, especially in the rush defensive department, I do think there's the ability for them to get consistent pressure here. So, man, I wish I had a better matchup to fade Colorado this week, but those opportunities are coming. So little hint, wink,
relax,
wink towards next week.
Relax.
So,
Brad, you can't put the cart before the horse. You're going to create a mad dash at the betting window when that potential number opens for next week.
Let's get a nice 40-point Colorado win.
But Payne, when you look at this game, and obviously it's a big number, we've been forced to talk about the Buffaloes, and rightfully so. They've been a good story for college football when a non-traditional power looks to have some buzzworthy elements to it. Is there a key matchup that you're going to be keeping your eye on in this spot? Again, not calling for Colorado State to go out there and pull off the outright upset, but to keep this game inside a number that could potentially be inflated given what we've seen from Colorado the first 2 weeks.
So the first thing is we love our listeners, and we let them vote, and this is what they chose. So here we are.
This was, to their credit, it was a resounding vote for LSU Mississippi State as their number 1 choice. The slate was so bad, we gave them the input to have 2 games, and this is what they came up with over Syracuse, Purdue, and the backyard brawl in Pitt and West Virginia.
I think Brad hit both sides of the ball perfectly, and Colorado State's making this change at quarterback to a redshirt freshman in Fowler Nicolosi, 3-star guy, low 3-star guy. And if you watch the Wazoo game, it looks nice. He put 2 touchdowns on the board in garbage time. One was a busted coverage, receiver wide open. The other, a one-handed miracle grab by his tight end Holker. All told, you look at the numbers, right, with lots of Wazoo backups in the game. Braden's adjusted accuracy, 68%, 15% turnover-worthy play rate. That's not good. And I also think the biggest key factor, Brad hit perfectly, it's Colorado State, their defense. It was a unit that trended well last season.
Yeah.
Some nice parts returned up front and in the secondary, but it was a really, really disappointing performance against Wazoo in the opener. I think that was shocking. But as soon as you watch it, and I watched it live and then I watched it again this morning, they don't have a ton of speed or athletes. Now, it's interesting. Colorado State gets an early season bye, so you do have 2 weeks to prepare for Sean Lewis offense. That's very much, to Brad's point, a spread attack again, a quarterback that keeps play alive. You'd hope something was learned, specifically not thinking you're going to be able to defend the slot with linebackers and safeties, because it was a field day for Wazoo in that area, and that's candidly like the weak spot of Colorado State. We saw it coming into the season. I mean, CSU lost, relatively speaking, their 2 stud linebackers in Cam Carter and DeQuan Jackson. You have a defensive coordinator in Freddie Banks who decided to ask his strong safety, Jack Howell, to defend the slot. And Howell just got torched against receivers. And you can't do that against Colorado. And Jack Howell allowed a perfect passer rating when targeted. Gave up 5 catches, including a 50-yard explosive touchdown. Got called for a penalty as well. So if you're going to stick a strong safety in the slot against a Colorado receiver, like it's going to be a good night. So Colorado State has to figure out how to protect the middle of the field on defense. If not, it's going to be really difficult to stop Colorado. Now, again, relatively speaking, Colorado State's front has been decent. Certainly Colorado's O-line isn't a strength. You like to see that CSU front, right? 17.5% havoc rate. And that was stepping up in class against Wazoo on the road. Now, CSU secondary, Brad and I have mentioned it, right? Got torched in that opener. They don't really have the level of athlete that Colorado has out wide, but virtually every single key cog from the Rim secondary that was one of the better ones in the Mountain West last season returns. So you would hope that some positive regression would be here based upon that. But boy, the Wazoo receivers were streaking wide open all day. And I just, I don't have anything actionable on this game. My number currently just does not get to 23.5, but I think as Brad kind of let the cat out of the bag there, we're kind of biding our time here for some better spots down the line.
It's such an interesting game when you look at just the number on the surface, because Colorado State was posted at a handful of books before the season started. Colorado was listed as a 10-point favorite, and when you looked at Colorado's schedule, you figured this was a spot where they could potentially get off the deck and get their first win of the season. I don't think anybody anticipated them going into Fort Worth other than folks inside that locker room and winning outright as a 3-touchdown underdog, following it up with a commanding at least second half performance against Nebraska. But you look at what some of these numbers tell you. Brad, you talked about it week 1, and you mentioned it again, that you had Colorado State against Washington State. That game closed in that 7.5, 8 range. Suddenly, Washington State doesn't look like a paper tiger by any stretch when they physically held up with Wisconsin last week and were able to win that game outright as an underdog. So fascinating things at play here. Colorado's stock obviously at the top of the market. You wonder if this is a price tag too big for them to get to, but we'll watch and see where this number goes as we kind of sit in that 23.5 territory before Saturday night's showdown.
Todd, the other thing here that's somewhat interesting, and it's a little bit narrative based, but Deion, when it comes to football, has no problem embarrassing people. And if you've kind of followed this, I know Colorado State a couple years back were kicking the tires on hiring Deion, and it never came to fruition. And I know Colorado State had hosted both his sons on recruiting visits, and they never ended up going there. So I don't know if there's a little added motivation here, very narrative based, but again, you get the game day game. It is causing the inflation, but Deion has no problem embarrassing people, and especially a team in his home state.
No, I will say that much. I don't think Colorado State is recruiting the same end of the talent pool as Colorado, but what I did find interesting along those same lines, Payne, Deion said he didn't know the history between these two programs, where he said last week was personal against Nebraska. Didn't come out with that same fire and level of intensity, but there's no doubt if they have a chance to make a statement, they will definitely try and do so. That picture of Coach Bobo along with the Sanders boys was very interesting. Deion saying that he remembers his boys potentially fighting on that particular trip, probably because they wanted to bring a girl back to the room they were staying in. So always interesting when you get some of these nuggets and tidbits. You get pulled into that wormhole doing your reading and research, trying to find that intangible edge when you're looking to try and bet some of these games. You can follow Brad on Twitter at BradPower7. You can follow Payne there as well at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Fuhrman. Most importantly, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. Gentlemen, I love to bust balls as much as anybody else, but I have to admit that I was remiss in my job as host at the top of the show. We got so caught up talking about a potential Sunshine State showdown between Florida State and Miami if these teams continue to play at the level they do, that we didn't recap or at least offer up some thoughts on the biggest game that we saw unfold last Saturday. And that, of course, was Texas going on the road to Alabama, not only covering as a 7-point underdog, but winning that game outright, something that you don't see all that often during Nick Saban's tenure, and it's typically been Heisman caliber quarterbacks to accomplish that feat. But when we broke that game down going into week 2, we had some major concerns about the Alabama offense, and while Jalen Milroe flashed once or twice with a big throw, that Texas defense exceeded expectations and then some. So I was curious to get your takeaways on what you saw there, guys, that we can apply going forward. And Brad, we'll give you the floor first.
Yeah, two fronts. I'll start with the Texas offense. Obviously, Quinn Ewers, deep threat as far as his deep passing ability was questioned. And going back to the second half of last season and even the Rice game, first game of this season, wasn't very accurate in the deep ball. Well, we got that answered. Several deep ball completions there, and didn't have the catastrophic mistake. I'll say this: Texas won the line of scrimmage on that side of the ball, and obviously Alabama with some key personnel, maybe not 100% on the back end, got exposed. And I thought it was a great game plan, offensive game plan that Sark had. On the other side of the ball, Texas defensive line, I thought, controlled the line of scrimmage, and Jalen Milroe had the two catastrophic mistakes. An interception early in the game gave Texas momentum, and just when they had to answer a Texas score late in the game, he throws a pick that sets up Texas in short field opportunity to basically put the game away. So I thought Texas, this wasn't anything fluky. Usually when Alabama loses in the last 10, 12 years, it's a kick six, it's 4 or 5 turnovers, it's some immaculate play that happens. This wasn't the case. I thought Texas legitimately was the better team.
Completely concur. Yeah. I think what they did up front along the defensive line was pretty impressive, and it kind of lets you know moving forward that this is very much an SEC caliber-like defensive line. We thought the defense in general was going to be much improved this season, and I understand this wasn't some historically good Alabama offense, but you think about the environment, you think about what Alabama actually wanted to do, right? Go out and impose their will and be this physical running team, and it just wasn't the case. Alabama had a 33% rushing success rate. The game was forced into Milton's hands more than I think Alabama would have liked, and he made some crucial mistakes. Certainly hit the deep ball, and that's kind of what we'd said. If you could limit that, not make him, get to his second read, get to his third read. And we just saw some horrific throws that ultimately changed and swung the complete game there. I don't want to celebrate prematurely like Ray Jackson did against Chung Lee, but I think we are looking pretty good on our under 10.
One last thing on
there, boys.
We also gave out Texas too, to do
Big
some
12.
Damage.
That's right.
One last thing on Alabama. Right. When you look at Jalen Milroe's performance, and look, Texas's defense is one of the best in the country. There are very few teams that are going to be able to match Alabama in the trenches. Would you consider exploring that quarterback room? Because it wasn't like Milroe was a runaway to take the job. If you want to achieve a higher ceiling for Alabama, do you think we could see a scenario where Tommy Rees and company trot out a different starting quarterback sooner rather than later?
I don't think they have one, Brad. And you've obviously seen Buckner more than I have, but Ty Simpson clearly didn't progress in fall camp. And so I think what we've said all season is the ceiling might not be there. You just need the highest floor guy to go and get you 9-10 wins so Georgia doesn't increase the gap in recruiting. And that's kind of been my entire thought process. In a down year, go win 9-10 games and lessen the variance and just run Jalen Milroe as much as you can and hope the mistakes get limited.
Going to be an interesting team to watch. We'll see how the market prices them. Obviously, the next major test for Alabama doesn't come this Saturday in Tampa against South Florida, but it'll come the following week when they take on Lane Kiffin and the Ole Miss Rebels. All right, gentlemen, we broke down 6 games, not as extensively as we've grown accustomed to around here, but when the schedule offers up lemons, you try and make lemonade. Games, at least on paper, next week. Much more intriguing, and I'm sure we'll have plenty to add to some of the nationally televised contests. But it is the weekly best bet portion of the program. We've gotten off to a torrid start, and Payne wasn't sure what you had in store for our loyal listeners to find something actionable this fine Saturday.
Well, I think we were kind of in between here. We both liked one specific game, and so all 3 of us are on the call for this best bet. We all like it. We all agree. We broke this game down a little bit earlier, so it'll be time-stamped to hear all our thoughts. Brad, do you want the floor here? Because I know this is your baby. This is your favorite one of the week. We also like it, but I will give you the floor.
Yeah, LSU,
okay.
minus 9.5. Few 9s still out there, but it looks like as we're recording this, some of those are being taken away. But you can find as low as 9 in the market. We're going to go ahead, and it's always scary laying, being the road favorite in conference play. But I just don't see a pathway to success on either side of the ball for Mississippi State, and I'll let you expound on any of that. But I also think we didn't mention when we were breaking the game down, I think big coaching mismatch here. I'm not buying the Mississippi State coaching staff. experience-wise just isn't there. I think if you ask them, was anybody to a man on that staff, would they feel like they'd be in the position that they are in today, just 365 days ago? And I don't think that would be the case. So if anything, with Brian Kelly, he's got a very experienced staff, OC, DC. He's got 30-plus years. I think they kind of imposed their will here. LSU -9, 9.5 to play.
Love it. I think just kind of surface level, what we talked about a little bit deeper in the preview itself, if you're not going to go back and listen, was very much the way you need to attack LSU's defense is down the field, through the air with bigger receivers, and they're just not allowing Will Rogers to throw the ball enough. You'll certainly see an uptick here just based upon the state of the game, but how he's throwing it. 5.1 yards against Arizona. Did not really have a big physical receiver. It's a lot of bubble screen, wide receiver screen stuff. They want to transition to being a running football team, and it's very difficult to kind of overhaul an entire offensive line that was recruited for the air raid to then go play bully ball against Wingo and Smith inside. So also we've seen some, Todd, you mentioned this at the top, kind of like the differing perceptions of these games. Obviously LSU, much closer to Florida State early on in that game. Mississippi State probably the beneficiary of some turnover fortune there against Arizona. 3 picks in the first quarter, probably not very impressive there. So we all agree here, correct, boys? Let's lay that. We'll call it officially 9.5 on LSU, but to Brad's point, shop around, there is some 9 in the market.
It's amazing what they say in the
LSU
betting market, evolve or die. We started out Payne as the home of the first half under. Those markets got more efficient, and people are going to start referring us to the unofficial home of the road favorite. The way we're going, back-to-back weeks, SEC teams on the road, won in non-conference play last week, albeit with a little bit of added intel that helped get us across the finish line at Tulane, and we'll back the LSU Tigers here in where they can re-announce that they're going to be a force in the SEC West all season long, and the game against Florida State, when we look back on it, may be just an anomaly or a credit to how good and deep Florida State is on the offensive side of the ball. All right, gentlemen, I think we've done enough damage for this fine Wednesday morning. Wasn't sure if you guys had anything else you'd like to get off your respective chests before we reconvene next week and we tell Brad how many points his beloved Fighting Irish are going to lose by against the Scarlet and Gray.
No, I think we're good. Somehow we managed to go well over an hour here, even with this slate of games. I know Brad was venting off air amongst the three of us moments ago. He more than welcome to share those thoughts, or maybe it was me. I can't remember.
Yeah, we can save that.
What? No.
We can save that venting for a later date.
Perfect.
That'll be must-see TV when we eventually get to that point, and a teaser somewhere down the road, whether it happens in 2023 or before Payne goes into retirement somewhere around 2040. We'll get it all off our chest. But for Brad Powers, Payne Insider, I'm Todd Fuhrman. Best of luck with all of your college football Week 3 investments, and come Saturday early afternoon out here on the West Coast with an LSU ticket in hand, we'll see you at the window.
We hope you enjoyed listening to this episode of Bet the Board. Make sure you follow Todd and Payne on X. Todd is at Todd Fuhrman. That's TODDFUHRMAN. And Payne is at Payne Insider. That's PAYNEINSIDER. Don't forget, our weekly newsletter comes with an additional best bet. Have that delivered to your inbox by clicking the link atop the podcast show notes. And most importantly, subscribe and download Bet the Board. We're on Apple, Spotify, Amazon Wondery, YouTube, Google Podcasts, and all your other major platforms.